Good morning. You're listening to the F-Files on 88.7 FM, WNHU West Haven. Today I'm here with Noam Chomsky, who is professor of linguistics at MIT. He is widely known, especially internationally, for his media criticism and radical politics, and is author of several books, including his most recent, Hegemony or Survival, America's Quest for Global Dominance, Failed States, The Abuse of Power and the Assault on Democracy, Manufacturing Consent, and many more. Welcome to the show.
Glad to be with you.
And I'm also here with Derek Shannon, who is a PhD student in sociology, an anarchist activist, and owner of Wooden Man Records. Welcome.
Hello, Jackie.
I'd like to ask you a question, Noam, about the derogatory words used to describe women in our society. And words such as bitch, for example, have become so widely used and accepted among both men and women without protest, and in some instances more acceptable than racist terminology. Why do you think that is, and do you think it's an indicative of our status in society?
Well, these are cultural questions. So, why was nigger once usable and now not usable except in special ways? Those are changes in culture. Why do we? And those are very complicated ones. So, for example, here in North America, we don't refer to the indigenous population anymore as Indians.
Right.
In South America, they refer to themselves as Indians. I just got back from South America and met with a lot of activists from various groups, Mapuche, Aymara, and others. And they freely refer to themselves as Indians.
Right.
Whereas here they don't. Although at one point they did. There was an American Indian movement. These changes, which go on all the time, just reflect different sensibilities as to how the dignity and rights of groups ought to be recognized. It goes along with changes in social and cultural patterns, and in fact moral changes about equal rights and equal treatment. But there's nothing specifically linguistic to say about it.
Okay, I just thought, you've once said that language is a core property that defines human beings, and I just, there's so many derogatory words used to define women, and I just see that as indicative of women's status in society, and people often...
Yeah, but the same would be true about anything else. Kike, nigger, Indian, anything, Polak, wop. I mean, it was once pretty free to use the word wop.
I know.
I recall once back in the early 30s when there was a lot of enthusiasm in the United States, especially in the business world, about Mussolini. They loved him, Italian fascism. There was once a cover story in Fortune magazine, from memory, but I think it's correct, a cover story which said something like, "The wops are unwopping themselves."
Oh my God.
Meaning the Italians are finally getting it straight. Well, I don't think you could say that today.
Yeah, no, definitely not.
But it's not, it's not a matter of the nature of language. It's the nature of our culture and our society.
Okay.
I had a question for you that's a little more broad and about radical organization. There are people in our state, in Connecticut right now, that are trying to form a federation of different people that fall under this umbrella term that you talk a lot about, libertarian socialism, from anarchists to left-wing Marxists, and we're trying to create like a group that's inclusive of these ideologies. And in preparing for this interview, I read in your interview with Red and Black Revolution that you said, if the left is understood to include Bolshevism, then I would flatly dissociate myself from the left. Lenin was one of the greatest enemies of socialism. I was wondering if you'd be willing to expand on that a bit. For example, what alternatives do you see for organization and goals to the Leninist project, and how can left-wing Marxists and anarchists in their current state of disorganization, or at least in the United States, revitalize libertarian ideas and methods to achieve a more sane and just society?
Well, first of all, just as a matter of historical fact, the left Marxists were anti-Leninist. You take a look at Lenin's pamphlet on what he called ultra-leftism. He was actually, the people he were condemning were mainstream Marxists, but left Marxists. They're not known now because the losers usually are unknown, but they were very important people. Anton Pannekoek others were leading Marxist thinkers and activists, and they were very anti-Leninist. In fact, Trotsky was anti-Leninist until he joined up with him. And there was a reason. I mean, the reason actually was described by Trotsky in his anti-Leninist days earlier. They said the Leninist approach substitutes the party for the proletariat, substitutes the central committee for the party, and substitutes the supreme leader for the central committee. And that's a highly authoritarian form, very anti-socialist in any sense of socialism. And, here we come into questions of interpretation, but my own view, the way I read the history, is that Lenin took a sort of a left Marxist position, kind of a libertarian position, pretty close to the anarchists, in one period of his life.
State and Revolution.
From April 1917 up till October 1917. And that was, in fact, the period in which he was trying to gain public support. And the mood in Russia was very revolutionary. I mean, there were workers' councils, there were Soviets, there was all kinds of peasant associations, a lot of radical activism, and looks to me as if he was kind of opportunistically trying to appeal to it by saying, look, I'm one of you. However, before that and after that, his writing and practice were very different. As soon as they took power in October, they very quickly, Lenin and Trotsky, dismantled the socialist institutions of the pre-takeover period, dismantled the workers' factory councils. The Soviets were very much weakened. Constituent Assembly, which did reflect, peasant, largely peasant revolutionary movements, that they dismantled that. Later came the crushing of the workers' revolutions in Kronstadt, the anarchist revolutions in the South, and so on, and they established a highly centralized dictatorial system, which had nothing whatsoever to do with socialism.
Right.
And I think they probably did it on principled grounds. They were sort of orthodox Marxists of a certain kind, who held that this backward peasant society, very poor backward peasant society, Russia, just wasn't at the stage where it could move to socialism. It had to be driven through by force, through some kind of state capitalism, and finally, by the iron laws of history, et cetera, et cetera. So I suspect it was kind of a principled approach, but one which was very anti-socialist. And since they happened to be successful, the subsequent movements that are called socialist were often Bolshevik or Bolshevik tinged. It's in that sense that I think that Leninism was and Bolshevism were just an enemy of socialism from the beginning.
Right.
However, I don't see that as a problem of organization in the United States. I mean, there is a strong libertarian left tradition in the United States. It's just, it's everywhere. It's in the workers' movements, in the women's movement, everywhere. That's just the spirit that's there. You go back to working class literature in the 19th century, which was very rich and lively in the factories, the mills around eastern Massachusetts where I live. It was a lot of it was written by women, young women off the farms. They were called factory girls. A lot by poor artisans, Irish workmen coming in from Boston, ran their own press. It's very interesting, very libertarian. Just took for granted that the people who work in the mills should own them. That the industrial system that's being imposed on them is depriving them of their dignity, their individuality, even their culture, and so on. And they were very bitter about it. It was kind of like they had no contact with European socialism or anarchism, but they invented it. They didn't even invent it; it just sort of was in their bones. I mean, in the late 19th century, working for a wage was considered something very demeaning. It wasn't very different from slavery. That was such a popular idea that it was even a slogan of the Republican Party. You could temporarily be a wage worker, but only in order to gain your freedom. Just as to free the slaves, you wanted to free the wage workers. And I think that feeling, that kind of mood, is barely below the surface in the United States. There are a lot of very positive things about the society and culture here as compared with others. One is that there's much less deference than you find in, say, European societies, which are more hierarchic. So, a car mechanic and a college professor, take your choice, they just talk to each other at the same level. There's no deference relations. One of them can do one thing, one of them can do another thing. That's quite different if you go to European societies. And it shows up in many ways. I think that's why the movements of the 60s, including the feminist movement, were able to break through so quickly and change patterns so radically, because it was sort of tapping something that's just under the surface. And I suspect that's true of radical organizing today. You're really tapping feelings which are maybe concealed, but not very deeply concealed.
I know you've done a lot of study with libertarian organizations in the past, and if the liberation of workers has to come from the workers themselves, do you think that this can be said for women's groups as well? Do you think that women need to organize separately from, say, other social movements or workers' movements, but work alongside them? Because I had talked to Martha Ecclesberg, who is author of The Free Women of Spain, and these were a group of anarchist women during the Spanish Civil War, and they felt the need to organize separately, but alongside,
Separately, alongside, and together. There were women who were among the leading activists in the anarchist movements, some of whom, incidentally, wanted to maintain aspects of the culture which other women regarded as degrading, like this kind of flirting tradition in Spain. There were debates about that. But if you look at the development of the women's movement here in the last 30, 40 years, it did begin with women's groups, consciousness-raising groups, and so on. How long it should be isolated, how separated it should be from others, I don't think there are formulas for that. It depends on what the circumstances are, what the next proper stage is for activism. So, for example, let's say in the global justice movements, I don't see that there's any particular reason for separate women's groups. They're working together on the same things. There are separate women's problems. There are also separate youth problems, separate minority problems, and so on. And where such problems arise, you deal with them in your own group.
You were talking before about this kind of libertarian consciousness in the United States, and I do find that, I don't know, that's something that's replete in the literature, this idea that individual freedom is something that's very important. And I've noted in work in a lot of libertarian socialist organizations, NEFAC is a good example, that they've tried to link this spirit up with people in indigenous movements in South America. The Magonistas and the Zapatistas come to mind immediately. I was wondering if you had any opinion on how we can, interrelate those struggles and support the struggles that the indigenous people have in South America, and create networks between these two groups.
Well, first of all, the individualism in the United States is real, but I think we should be conscious that right alongside of it, there's a long tradition of solidarity. Individualism didn't mean what Ayn Rand means.
Right.
It meant you work jointly with other people. Suppose you're farmers in, say, a farming community, and people work together all the time. You build a barn, you build together. You pick the crops. There's plenty of cooperation. In working class organization, of course, it was very highly cooperative, and solidarity was it's kind of like the chief slogan idea of the workers' movements. So individual freedom, but in solidarity and cooperation with others. As to the indigenous movements, there's a fair amount of interaction now, and it's important. And they have complex and varied problems. So when you go to, say, South America, where there are very substantial movements, like in Bolivia, it's the majority of the population. From one group place to another, their problems happen to be very different.
Right.
I mean, it's very much my mind now because I've just come from there a couple of weeks ago. But say the Aymara in northern Chile and the Aymara in Bolivia, who are right next to each other, face completely different problems. In one, in Bolivia, they've largely, to a large extent, taken over the country.
Mm-hmm.
In Chile, right across the border, they're wondering if they can survive. And are oppressed and separated from the larger society and trying to sort of maintain some integrity.
Mm-hmm.
And everywhere you look, the problems are varied and different. The Zapatistas have been an inspiration to a lot of the activism of the 1990s. I really don't think you can find general formulas for this.
Mm-hmm.
It just varies in circumstances and problems, and in each case it should be dealt with the kind of sympathy that arises from the feelings of the commitment to solidarity and cooperation while preserving individual freedom.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that you wrote in manufacturing consent? I just did an area exam in media too, so this is like right on the edge of my mind.
Could you talk a little louder? I'm sorry, I can't hear.
Yeah, you write in manufacturing consent about ideology and about its role in kind of, well, to use your phrase, or rather to use the phrase that you borrowed, it manufactures the consent of the governed, and you talk about how this consciousness is kind of below the surface in the United States. I think that radical, activists often find it very difficult to use the language that we've built up around radicalism in order to describe our politics to people who would otherwise be sympathetic to it.
Yeah.
Have you found that in your own work?
Oh, that's certainly true. I mean, take say the word socialism.
Right.
I mean, as soon as you use that term in the United States, it evokes a whole set of constructed imagery about Mao's Cultural Revolution,
mm-hmm.
Stalin's Purge, so on and so forth. None of which have anything to do with socialism, but it's been tarred with that brush. Look, it's even happened to the word liberal. I mean, what word could be more innocuous?
Mm-hmm.
But that word has become a kind of curse word. Nancy Pelosi is a California liberal. Can't vote for her, that sort of thing. So sure, there's the doctrinal system is it puts huge amounts of efforts. Doctrinal institutions put tremendous amounts of efforts into demonization, and that partly involves labeling. And that leaves radicals with a choice, radical activists. Should we come out and say, look, socialism is an ideal that we really should struggle for, and here's what it really means? Should we try to do that, or should we just say, well, let's forget the word and look at the concepts?
Mm-hmm.
Should the people who work in, say, a factory own and manage the factory? Should they work together with community or with communities that are actually run democratically? And should they all integrate? Well, okay, you can go on. Should we eliminate the necessity to rent yourself in order to survive?
Mm-hmm.
Those topics can all be discussed without ever using the word socialism. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's the right way to go.
Again, you're listening to the F-Files on 88.7 FM. I'm here with Noam Chomsky, who is professor of linguistics at MIT and is author of several books, including the most recent, Hegemony or Survival, America's Quest for Global Dominance. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Okay, glad to be with you.